As World War I raged on in Europe, Allied forces were facing some of the most destructive and brutal fighting the world had ever seen. Trench warfare had caused stalemates across battlefields, and the British were desperate to find a way to turn the tide of the war. The solution? Tanks. And it all started with a tank nicknamed Little Willie. This was the first tank ever developed. Little Willie never saw the field of battle, but the development and lessons learned from its construction allowed British forces to create tanks that would aid in the war effort and allow the Allied powers to be victorious. Little Willie was the first tank as we think of them today. However, there were vehicles that came before it which were designed to aid infantry in battle. For example, in 1899, Frederick Sims designed the War Car, which had a bulletproof casing and Maxim guns. It was basically a heavily armored truck and was the precursor to the armored cars used by the military today. It was in 1914 that Ernest Swinton, a British Army colonel, and William Hankey, secretary of the Committee for Imperial Defense, came up with the idea of a heavily armed vehicle that would be able to aid infantry troops in moving across the battlefield. Their thought process was that the vehicle would be useful for driving over rough terrain, such as shell craters, deep mud, and trenches. But the most important obstacle the vehicle needed to overcome was barbed wire to break through enemy lines. They presented their plans to Winston Churchill, who quickly got on board with the land ship idea. He then organized the Land Ships Committee to begin developing the prototype of what would become Little Willie. In order to keep his new project secret from British enemies, workers were told the vehicle they were building would carry water on the battlefield. It was not too far-fetched, as the new prototype did resemble a water tank, though the tanks during this war would be referred to as land ships among military circles, and once they were unveiled on the battlefield, the original secret term of tank was utilized after the war by historians, and the name has stuck ever since. The first tank, later called Little Willie, was completed around September 8, 1915. It was initially designed by R.E.B. Cromptonby as half of an agricultural vehicle called Juggernaut or Slug. This vehicle was then sent to August Triton, who modified it so it would work on its own. Finally, the design was sent to William Foster and Company of Lincoln, who built Little Willie. The first name given to the tank was No. 1 Lincoln Machine. It weighed 16.5 tons and was designed to aid the Allies in trench warfare. The name of the tank was changed to Little Willie based on an insult to German leadership. Little Willie was alleged to be the nickname that the British gave to the German Crown Prince Kaiser Wilhelm, though historians debate when and exactly who started calling this little machine Little Willie. The mocking of the Crown Prince has forever ended up as an affectionate name for the first real tank ever produced. Putting together Little Willie was no easy feat. Such an ambitious project had never been attempted before, with this early design looking quite foreign to the tanks we see today, especially with its tracks and running gears separate from the hull. Assembling the tank was also a product of inter-country cooperation, with the tracks themselves coming from the U.S., though it's doubtful any Americans knew the true purpose of these tracks due to the top-secret nature of the program. The body and the turret were built separately and eventually welded together, adding the holes in the hull late in the design process. The uncut hull looked similar to a water carrier from Mesopotamia, giving the perfect top-secret cover in case any word ever made it back to the Germans about their potentially groundbreaking invention. The final model had 10 to 15 millimeter thick armor and could hold a crew of 5 soldiers. Little Willie was powered by a Daimler inline 6-cylinder engine that put out 105 horsepower. Considering the bulkiness and weight of Little Willie, the engine gave the tank a top speed of about 3 miles per hour, which was a good pace during the time of the tank's inception. In order to help Little Willie steer, rear wheels were attached to the tail of the tank. On rougher terrain, the tank would slow down one of the tracks to turn. Due to transmission limitations of the time, the constant braking of a single track would cause the engine to lose half its power, causing significant stress to the tracks, brakes, transmission, and clutch. On good terrain, the rear wheels would allow Little Willie to turn slightly, thus alleviating some of the stress on the other parts of the tank. These rear wheels also helped with trench crossings, as they would allow the tank to go over longer stretches of trenches. The ride inside Little Willie was a little uncomfortable, because like almost all vehicles of the day, it had no suspension. This would make for a rough ride, but at 3 miles per hour, it wasn't too bad. The weaponry on Little Willie would have worked well in combat. The tank's main armament was a Vickers 2-pounder gun on a revolving turret on top of the tank. If necessary, the tank also was designed to replace the Vickers with other armaments such as a Maxim, Hotchkiss, Lewis, or Madsen machine guns. These guns were never fitted onto Little Willie, as the tank would not see combat. However, its big brother, Big Willie, would make it into battle and help in the efforts against the Central Powers. The British Army ordered 100 No. 1 Lincoln machines to be used in the war. Unfortunately, during testing, Little Willie was found to have significant transmission problems that resulted in getting stuck in trenches or rendering the tank immovable. The initial tracks on Little Willie would not reconnect properly while going over rough terrain, and this could cause the tank to sometimes throw a track. This led to a redesign and inclusion of Triton tracks, which fixed the problem, but at this point Little Willie had been relegated to testing only and would not be used in battle. Little Willie and subsequent tanks during World War I were designed to be used exclusively for long offensive operations. These missions tended to be in a very specific area, and the tanks would be used to slowly move across no man's land in the trenches. The soldiers would follow the tank across the battlefield using it as mobile cover as they advanced. They were also designed to be a mobile pillbox that could suppress enemy trenches so the soldiers could traverse no man's land safely. It would not be until World War II that the concept of tank-on-tank battles would be formulated, though there would eventually be one such battle later in World War I. Once they reached the enemy trench, the soldiers would enter and clear it of Central Power soldiers as the tank continued on. The one main problem that engineers ran into with tanks was that the massive weight would cause strain on the engine. This would lead to overheating. Unfortunately, an overheating engine inside a large enclosed metal vehicle is like turning on the burners of an oven on full blast while you're inside it. The overheating problem was the same for Little Willie and would not be solved for many generations of tanks. Little Willie was very useful for engineers when identifying problems and coming up with solutions. Using what they learned from Little Willie, the Brits built a bigger, better version of the tank called Big Willie. This was done between Little Willie's first design and second design. Big Willie ran into some similar problems as its little brother, such as the tracks falling off. This meant that the difficulties engineers ran into with Little Willie were vital problems to solve, as other tank designs would have run into them as well. On the first version of Little Willie, the tracks only went partway up the body of the tank. This seemed like a good idea at the time because it saved on material and made the tank a little lighter, but the tracks would damage easily or come off when driving over rough terrain, so the engineers went back to the drawing board and came up with a new idea. They redesigned the tracks to encircle the entire body of the tank from top to bottom. This was done to allow Little Willie and future tanks to traverse wider trenches and allowed the use of an unditching beam. It was due to the trial and error of Little Willie that better track systems were made and flaws that may have been fatal in battle were identified and fixed. Without Little Willie, the British may have never designed their rhomboid-shaped tracks, and the evolution of the tank could have taken many more years. Little Willie also validated that engine, transmission, steering, and braking systems would work for all tanks. Without the validation, the whole project might have been scrapped, and the British might have given up on tanks altogether. So even though Little Willie never saw combat, without it Britain may well have never fully developed tank technology that helped to win World War I. Another aspect of Little Willie that made it so important to history was the potential that political and military leaders saw in it. Although flawed in some ways due to all sides wanting to break the stalemate of trench warfare, new and ambitious ideas were given intense study when before they might not have even seen the light of day. Even though Little Willie never saw combat, the lessons learned helped accelerate the British tank program greatly and showed strategists that it was possible to build a machine that could traverse trenches and no man's land to support Allied troops in World War I. Even though Little Willie contributed much to the development of tanks and is a crucial stepping stone in the history of armored warfare, it was almost lost to history. The British government wanted to scrap it, but thanks to military history enthusiasts within the Army, Little Willie found its final resting place at Bovington Training Ground, where it remained until the end of the war and was eventually sent to the Tank Museum in Bovington after the end of World War II. Despite being almost lost to history, without those initial tests, valuable lessons and information learned from the building of Little Willie would never have been gained. The success of British tanks during World War I might have been hindered, and the course of history may have gone a different way. Maybe Little Willie's biggest contribution in the world of warfare is the nostalgia that went along with it. Curators at the Tank Museum in England are proud to display the first tank ever made. At the time Little Willie rolled onto the testing field, the automobile had only been around for about 35 years. That is a lot of progress in such a short amount of time. Little Willie could be outfitted with guns, a crew of 5, and could successfully cross trenches in the heat of battle, something that no other vehicle at the time could do. Without Little Willie and the lessons learned from it, the development of the tank may have taken years longer to complete. There's no telling what impact this may have had on the course of history. It was through the process of modern engineering and science that Little Willie was made a reality. The British basically took the idea of an armored battleship and brought it to the land. Even though Little Willie never saw combat, it was something that had never been done before and had a lasting impact on history. Now, go see what Little Willie evolved into by watching the top 10 most powerful tanks. Or for tank battles, watch the Battle of 73 Easting, the most intense tank battle in history.